Just Google SCRA community psychology competencies, and you'll see it all laid out for you. What we're wanting to do is really engage as many people as possible, and this is the beginning of it, in a discussion. We originally thought what we would do is publish a paper and then get responses to it, but I think what's going to happen, and you'll hear it from David, is we're going to put a piece out and then ask for a lot of people to respond to it. So this is the beginning of this process. And let me bring you back to the beginnings. Community psychology, the Council on Community Psychology didn't used to be a council, it used to be an interest group. And I think you said it was 2006, David, that the definition came out. We held our first gathering of practicing community psychologists at the biennial in Pasadena. And we had about 100 people, both academics and practice folks, together talking about what their interests were. And a number of things emerged out of that. There was the issue of publications. How do we publish? Where do we publish? And out of that came the development of the Global Journal on Community Psychology Practice. We talked about, what are the competencies? And it took a couple of years, but at some point, Greg Meisen, who was very involved, and he may be on the call, and I visited with the Council on Educational Practices, which has been the only council in SCRA at that point in time. And we said to them, we'd like to work with you to create the definitions of community psychology practice. And they were great. And Jim Dalton really led kind of herding cats on that issue and came up with a piece, Susan Wolff, which you can find, which is that definition. And earlier than that was that, let me go back, that after the conference in Pasadena, Julian, who's on the call, took the responsibility of pulling people together and putting the words together. And then we went to the first international conference in Puerto Rico and presented what we had as a draft of a definition. And we got international feedback on it. And then David published it, I think, in the Community Psychologist as the starting definition. And that was in the email that I sent. And it's really pretty simple: to strengthen the capacity of communities to meet the needs of constituents and help them to realize their dreams in order to promote well-being, social justice, economic equity, self-determination through systems, organizational, individual change. So we put that out, and in response to the person who said earlier on that people don't really know what I'm doing when I say I'm a community psychologist, this was our first attempt to put that out. Yep. But I'm sorry?
Yes.
And since that time, lots of stuff has happened. A whole set of competencies has been raised. A lot of issues about equity and disparities and racism and institutional racism have been raised. And there's an increased focus on systems and policy change, which had been missing from most psychology training. There's a lot of now interest in evidence-based research as informing practice. And then there was the article that was referred to earlier where we called for collaborating for equity and justice. So what we're looking to do is engage this broad group who's on the phone now and broader in re-looking at the definition and sort of saying, what do we have to do in 2019, 2020 to do anything to change that language, or is that language adequate? David, you want to add to that?
Sure. Just a couple of brief comments. As Tom mentioned, the definition, the earlier definition that was published in 2006 came out of a group process. It came out of the review of similar definitions across different fields and so forth. And I think that definition has served us well. But again, as Tom has suggested, in the last decade or so, the landscape has changed pretty significantly. So from my perspective, the identification of the practice competencies issues related to practice and systems change and policy development, which at this point would appear to be a significant focus for practitioners. Models like translational research and science to practice have emerged in recent years that I think are relevant. So it seems to be an opportune time to revisit the original definition of community psychology practice. And I think that the challenge is to understand how practice relates to similar constructs. For instance, community engagement. I'm often I often think of this discussion with colleagues and so forth, and I'm often asked, what's the difference between community practice and community engagement? I do think they're different. They're different concepts, but the definition by itself doesn't produce or doesn't suggest that to folks. So again, I think it's an opportune time for us to revisit the definition and perhaps add some detail that might be useful in thinking about practice in relationship to community engagement and so forth. Nicole, are you going to talk about the possibility or the idea of a special issue, or do you want me to address that?
She's on the agenda for that.
Yeah,
okay. Let me just say that David Julian was talking to us from Columbus, Ohio.
Yes, thank you, Tom.
And I am talking to you from Wichita, Kansas, the home and hot seat for Wichita State University. Just to give you a little bit of my background, I work for the Community Engagement Institute. Part of this whole discussion around names and how that integrates. A lot of what I do is evaluation research. So when I say I'm a community psychologist, a lot of people sort of blink at me and say, what does that mean? And even as an evaluation researcher, I think that tends to be defined a little bit differently. So one of the other things that the Community Engagement Institute currently does is we are the home for the Global Journal of Community Psychology Practice. And that is a journal really dedicated to publishing the work of practitioners. And sometimes that means peer-reviewed articles having to do with evaluation research or other types of intervention work. And sometimes it has to do with really just getting an important piece of practice information out to practitioners in a open access forum where you don't have to have a university library subscription to access it. We wanted to focus on the global aspect of it, so it's not just about America and American-based, US-based types of work. And so because the Global Journal of Community Psychology Practice was born out of the SCRA Practice Council and the need for this venue for both practitioners to publish, but also to get information that's important and relevant to their work, we thought that this would be really the perfect dissemination vehicle for a revisitation of the definition of community psychology practice and what that means. And so, what we'd like to do is be able to get those voices, all looking at this idea, and then publish a special issue that really goes through all of those different ideas about what it means to be a community psychology practitioner, and how that might be different from other types of practitioners, and how that might be different from other types of community psychologists. So that's kind of where the Global Journal sits in this particular discussion. We just really want to be able to disseminate this conversation in an easily acceptable or accessible way.
And I would add one other word about the Global Journal. Thank you, Nicole. Is that it's set up so that you can put in a tool that you're using that you find useful. You can submit videos. Gregor Sarkeesian from Antioch is doing an issue on, I'm blanking.
Surf therapy.
Surf therapy with people from all over the world. They had a conference in South Africa, and so they're going after that issue. And I said to Gregor, we were not going to publish it unless we have a video of him surfing. So that's, and we're not talking about surfing the web. So I think we're ready to open it up. I need to point out to you in the left-hand corner, it says recording. I had a number of requests for people who couldn't be on the call to see if they could hear a copy. So any of the special sessions we've had in from the Practice Council are on a page of the SDRA website. And Jean Hill very graciously agreed to record this. So I don't hope that doesn't intimidate anybody, but there are a lot of people who are going to miss it. So what we want to do is really say to you, what do you think about the idea of revisiting this in 2019? And how can we use a special issue to get the most input, and what kinds of things should be in that definition? So really, that's it. And Al Radcliffe appeared even though he said he wasn't going to.
Well, we just got home from Berlin last night, and I figured I'm so zorked that I wouldn't be much value at my community collaboration. So I thought, well, I'm doing laundry while it's washing, I'll sign in here.
And Al made the point, well, you should really say it, that we don't explicitly include collaboration with other disciplines.
And by other disciplines, I mean other professions.
Right.
That are also out in the community trying to accomplish similar or compatible things that community psychology is trying to accomplish.
Right. So the early article that was referenced was the article in the Nonprofit Quarterly, and that was written with all these other people, because when you work in a community, I never find a community psychologist. I find all kinds of wonderful residents, and I find people working in agencies and in education and the government. So this is a practice that's, comes from other places as well.
Sure.
Commentary from others, thoughts. Does this make any sense to you?
Hi, my name is Grishma Shah. I'm from National Louis University. We're hosting the biennial, so I look forward to seeing many of you there. One of the reasons why I was interested in getting into this call was because question 3 was looking at how we rely on evidence-based and what we're calling evidence. And a little bit about me, I'm actually an artist. I have my own film festival that I co-direct, and if you guys find yourself here in Chicago in August, please let me know. My film festival is completely accessible, completely free. It looks to push those stereotypes that we have about people with disabilities and all of that good stuff. And so art is this huge component of my work, of my life, and at the end of the day, what I'm noticing more is that even in community psychology, we're not really looking at art as evidence-based research. And I know that there's art-based research, and even within that, there's a lot of, it's kind of called like something softer. It's more qualitative, but even within the realm of qualitative research, it's still kind of like a very soft tool. And I wanted to know if there's a way for us to reinvent the definition of community psychology by actually talking to those that create the definition and have it go down the pipeline so that other practitioners can recognize that art-based research is actually research also.
Wonderful, wonderful. I had put a question in here, which is, can we take lessons from practice and call that evidence-based? Because that's mainly what I learned from trying things and having them succeed or fail. And I think that's true. Someone has a lot of noise in the background.
I was going to say, I'm just going to pause for a second. Since we are recording, if you're not speaking, if you could put the little mute button on, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Nicole. So I think you're right, which is, what do you learn from the world of art? and what are our lessons? And they don't call that evidence-based unless you're really doing some research. And I think, as a practitioner, I have a lot of evidence. I have 40 years of experience that tells me if I go into a community and I say such and such, I'm likely to get a pretty decent response. Have I, researched that? No. Is it valid? You betcha. Can I prove that? I don't know. But I think we don't want to lose all the knowledge that people have in their practice. So thank you very much for raising that. And the question is, how do we add that to the definition or to the competencies? Because evidence-based seems to generally not include that.
But evidence-based also is a phrase that's being used a lot when really there is no replication of the evidence in many cases, and we're really talking about evidence-informed, which would open the door to what she's suggested.
That's a lovely change of language. Right. They'll say that the project that they gave a big award to and became evidence-based was done in Pasadena, California with white high school juniors, and I'm working now in rural Massachusetts, and I should use that as an evidence-based program practice. And I don't believe it carries over 100%. So very helpful. Other thoughts? Are we catching some? Oh, we have it recorded, so we can get it from there. Yeah. Other thoughts from people?
So just to build on the comments about evidence, I've looked at definitions in medicine, and there's much more of or seems to be much more of a willingness to sort of, I recall a definition that speaks to clinical experience in addition to empirical evidence. And I certainly think in a practice context, that notion of experience is for me qualifies as evidence.
So it would be wonderful to write something on an experience-based as something that should be included, because I find it almost offensive when that's the rules, because it sounds like it's saying what you do doesn't count.
Yeah.
Other people want to weigh in on that? I'm open for this.
Hi, this is Rami. Can you hear me well? Because I'm walking.
Yes. There's a lot. If you could stop walking, the noise behind you would slow down.
Okay.
Oh, we can.
Okay. So yeah, I agree. And for me, a lot of the practice work is also trial and error. So as you evaluate, as you improve, as you work with the community, you start having a better feel of what the community needs are. So it will be helpful to have that kind of evaluation or that kind of discussions with the community to be part of what evidence-based is. Because a lot of the work that I've done back home in Lebanon is we start in something, and by the end of the third year, it's a whole different kind of project because of what participatory of the community says their needs are. So things have been changing from one term to another. So if we can include that in, let's say, the bigger picture of what community psychology is as a practice kind of side of it, that will be helpful also. Not just a lab kind of sense of evaluation that is pre-made, pre and post, but then that the practical side of how can we make it a realistic kind of evaluation that will work with nonprofits or whatever community organizer is, as well as for the community in addition to that.
And Rami, can you say where you are?
I'm in Oregon right now.
Okay. And you're one of the new leaders of the Practice Council, as I understand it.
Unofficially.
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 Okay. I blew that.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
People want to respond to what Rami said or add to it, or?
I don't know that it's an addition, it's adjacent. We'll call it adjacent. But I know that as an evaluator, there's a real tension between the idea of what you can prove works and what is just a suggestion of something working. And depending on the funder, that can be a real sticky situation, right? So if, for example, I'm working on a grant that's funded by SAMHSA, they have very particular ideas about evidence and what constitutes an evidence-based practice and how you show summative results. But if I'm working for a small nonprofit in Wichita, they may just need to understand the experience of the people that they're working with, and that in and of itself is evidence of summative improvement. And so I think the context around what that looks like and some of that trial and error and working with different partners, different funders, different clients, I think that's a challenge. And I don't know how that's addressed in a succinct definition, but I do think that that is a part of this evidence-based community work conversation that we're trying to sort of capture.
So there's a great question put out. How do we push the boundaries of the funders in this? And the other way to think about it is, when I get called into a community, there may be no funder other than the community or someone in the community. And the question is, what's important to show? And I think if we can get their vision of what's working and what's not working, that's plenty for them. They often, I have a very hard time going in and interesting the community in evaluation. And I think one of the real difficulties with evidence-based is we take programs and we impose them on communities because that's what we've been told to do. And then I have to come in and rescue the evaluator, the community, and everybody else who's being tortured by this being imposed on people.
Well, I want to jump back in for a second. If we insist on using the term evidence-based as a fundamental thing, rather than evidence-informed, would by definition disqualify the experience of the community people that we may be collaborating with.
Yep.
So this thread for me really offers an addition to the current definition, because for me, a major part of practice is managing that process. What we're describing is a situation where a number of different stakeholders are coming to the table with different opinions about what constitutes evidence. Yeah. And that process of moving from defining some issue that a community or some stakeholder wants to address, that conversation around how you do that, I think, is the essence of community practice. It's managing that conversation and assuring that stakeholders have an equal voice in deciding what is relevant in terms of evidence. And Nicole, I've been at the same table, have done a lot of work for SAMHSA, and you're right, they have a specific perspective around what constitutes evidence. And a lot of the communities that are being funded to do SAMHSA projects think about that very, very differently.
So the question was, how do we push the boundaries? And whoever asked the question should jump in. I just read it on the chat box. But how do we push the boundaries of the funders? Anybody ever have any success in that?
For me, not just the funders, though, also like the culture that we have in the community psychology field. Let's say, I don't have a PhD, so I'm not technically considered a community psychologist. What kind of, for me, how can we change? Because CRA is becoming more and more academic, at least from my perspective. How can we also include the academic kind of perspective, not just the funders, but those that are in the academia, to be part of the practitioner's kind of vision, not just like the academic vision of what community psychology is. So for me, it's not just like the funder, but also the academic world that we are part of.
It's SCRA and how they push that kind of concept. Now I've offended everybody. Okay.
Except me.
Who wants to jump in?
I want to jump in. This is Gloria Levin from Washington, D.C. I've been a practitioner, a community psychologist. Actually got my degree in community psychology for many, many years. And one thing to remember is the range. You're talking about SAMHSA, and I went to a community coalition last night of hunger programs in my county. And it's a very sophisticated county right outside DC. very high educational levels, etc. And I was shocked to find that the county is just now, through this coalition, working with groups to try and get this myriad of groups working on hunger, food insufficiency, etc., from a variety of different perspectives, to report data in the same way. And the county funds a lot of these projects, but through different pockets. This is 2019, and I was absolutely astonished that they were so proud of themselves because they came up with this idea that, gee, maybe we should be collecting data in similar ways so it can be additive and interpretable. And so remember that there's a very big range of practice out there.
Right, and there are many things that seem so logical that the system just doesn't do. They don't collaborate with each other, and they don't share that stuff. And it was one of the good things of collective impact, which is they were asking for finding similar evaluations across systems. Now, there are many other shortcomings from that, but.
Yeah, maybe I'll build on that. This is Megan. And as Tom knows, I started out in my coalition building work with his approach and his training, and then later on committed blasphemy by embracing collective impact. And I've actually just been at the Collective Impact Forum this whole week. I'm continuing to keep my finger on the pulse of what they're doing and what they're talking about and how they're evolving. I don't know if anybody else was there. But they had 800 people here in Chicago all this week, and I think I met one person there who it was not their first convening. So if anything, some part of what I'm seeing is just the growth of the movement. And so the two things that are coming up for me in this conversation, one is how do we differentiate and market and promote promote community psychologists within that space. But also, I can say the element that most helped me out of collective impact was the ability to speak back to the funders. And that was about two things. One of them was just the value of funding, the coalition building, community organizing, the function that what they call the backbone infrastructure could not for years get funding to really do that. And I know that as community psychologists, we're struggling to really have enough to support that work. And what really takes 3 times longer than what anybody ever funds, right? And so that element of just making sure that work is valued and funded. And the other piece, I think it actually connects to your number 2, this discussion you're having about what's considered evidence, and are we what type of evaluation are we coordinating it? Are we using developmental evaluation so that we are learning as we go? But I think there's also an element that connects to anti-racism and to collective impact is now grafting on racial equity, and it's interesting to see how they're doing that. But this question of whose knowledge do we respect and whose knowledge is considered valid. In the realm where we were pursuing with my prior organization, we were doing collective impact and racial equity work at the same time alongside each other, and we were able to push the funders and to push the funders against each other to recognize both of those things in a different way, the value of the funding the infrastructure, community work, and the applying an anti-racist lens to how we're evaluating our success. So I don't know if that's
Megan
helpful,
ran a U.S. breastfeeding coalition with coalitions in every state. Very impressive system. And what's interesting, if you want to talk about how do you move the funders, collective impact moved radically. Both foundations, state government and federal government, embraced collective impact and took it as their model. And those of us who've been doing coalition building for 40 years were just shoved out. I didn't feel shoved out by you, but moved aside maybe. And it was happening all over the place. And how did Collective Impact do it? Two very bright and slick consultants wrote a wonderful 6 or 8 page paper that was published.
Uh-oh, did I lose everybody or did we lose Tom?
I think Tom froze.
I
So I'm just having problems with Tom.
Oh.
One of the benefits of being in a rural community is the quiet. One of the difficulties is potentially Wi-Fi that doesn't cooperate. So we might give him a minute to come back. In the meantime, however, I think that some of this discussion around collective impact and the value that has, especially as it relates to talking to funders and getting that feedback loop closed, I think that is a valuable piece of how we talk about this definition of practice and what that means.
And just to build on that idea, you know, I've been in situations where community folks have pushed against funders' perspectives successfully. And I mean, the instance I'm thinking of are SAMHSA projects that were that funded tribal communities to provide behavioral health services, and the communities that we were working with had very different definitions of behavioral health than the traditional Western definition. And through a series of meetings and so forth, for this particular funding stream, SAMHSA actually changed their I don't know whether they ever changed the official definition, but communities were given significant latitude in defining behavioral health according to tribal traditions and so forth. And that came about through a systematic community effort with sort of professional evaluators and folks in support. So that's my experience in pushing funders' boundaries.
Are there others who want to talk about that dynamic between where the power to define evidence and where the power to define the variables of interest comes from, and some of the tension around that?
I don't understand the question.
Well, because we're talking a little bit about who gets to decide, whether it's the communities who get to decide or whether it's some top-down entity, name it what you want, who gets to decide what is considered data, or what is considered behavioral health, or what is considered the thing that's of interest to that community. And I think some of what community psychology is about is trying to redistribute that power. So if we're talking about a definition of practice, how do we go about integrating who gets that power?
So I have a thought. When we talk about the community, what if we go a step beyond that and it's a student that is wanting to take ownership of a project that they're doing, which is very arts-based, but the academia of community psychology doesn't recognize that this is, you know, for lack of a better word, legit enough. How do we even, you know, tackle those issues before becoming community psychologists so that we can tackle the other issues of the funders? I believe that it's actually starting from academia itself, because we are being trained to think a certain way, and then the communities are doing things very differently, and we're the middlemen or middlewomen, the liaisons between the community and academia. But as community psychologists, we're being trained to think like academics, even when you're writing a dissertation. You can't write it in a narrative form. You can't write it in a way that many people can understand it when our end goal is to connect with the community at the end of the day. If I'm lucky, maybe 250 people will read my dissertation, but what if I want to do it like a book or a narrative or a story, digital storytelling project, you know, knowing that there are so many other people at macro levels that can actually benefit from it. I think recently I saw somebody submit at SCRA, it was a comic strip about a hurricane, and I thought it was wonderfully done because, again, so many more people at a macro level are going to be understanding the impact of something like that rather than it being submitted to a journal.
Right. Yeah.
I'm back, sorry.
And we're back. Hi, Tom.
Well, in rural America, I all of a sudden have no internet service, so I'm on the phone.
So I'll comment just a little bit on the question about kind of distributing the power for kind of who gets to decide whether we're talking about certain metrics for maybe how an intervention is going to be evaluated, how success is going to be decided. I think we're seeing this pop up in several of our initiatives. Not sure this is precisely the bullseye for the conversation right now, but I just want to offer, you know, one of the things that we're really trying to do is build in planning periods for any of the evaluations that we're going to design. And those, it could be anywhere from 3 months to a year, kind of depending on the size. But the idea really is to immerse ourselves in understanding what the program really is about, understand the organization, understand the community where it's taking place, solicit a wide range of input and information, and, you know, to the extent possible, collaboratively develop a program design or an evaluation design moving forward. And I would say we have a wide range of success in that way, where some programs really do fall back to us just deciding and maybe, you know, getting some input after the thing is almost fully baked, all the way over to another project that is quite large right now, where we're very purposefully moving extremely slowly and really trying to pump the brakes in terms of not making key decisions on the project until our community members have really had a chance to weigh in authentically.
That's wonderful. And it's part of what at least got me and some others really going about collective impact.
Right.
Because it's all hierarchical and all top down, and it's very easy to please your funder. And I think when you ask, how do you get the funders to be happy? You say, we'll make it easy for you. It's 5 steps, and you don't have to talk to the community, because, you know, when you talk to the community, it gets messy. And so that's why it took off, in my opinion.
Messy, and to your point, time consuming.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. It slows everything down. But that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
So I'm here with Annie Wright in Dallas. My name is Erin Crosby, and I work for a center here at the university that does community collaboration based on collective impact. So it's interesting to hear the conversation about collective impact and community psychology while getting to do the work I do, and also knowing Annie and her background as a community psychologist. One of the things that I'm wondering about more and more as it relates to really shifting the paradigm with the funding community is one of the things that we see in a historically marginalized community that we work with is them, by virtue of gentrification, becoming more organized and starting to want to put into place some things like a master plan for their community, so that anything that comes into that community going forward has to align with the master plan. They're talking about the exact term, but essentially some community agreements with organizations or businesses that come into the community, where there has to be some negotiation to determine whether or not that thing, that development, that program fits within the community context and the vision that the community has for itself. So I mentioned all of that because I think those kinds of agreements would be a nice shift and necessary thing for funding organizations to fall in line with, essentially, that centers power and decision making on the front end with community, because one of the things that I find is funders, of course, get behind what they perceive to be great ideas that often come from outside the community. So basically having some agreement or understanding within philanthropic organizations that says if you want to do said project in these communities, you have to have on the front end some sort of documented, signed agreement for what that would look like before you can even pitch, or it has to be part of your proposal, are the kinds of things, again, that I say recenter community and set the terms of the development of the project and even the evaluation in ways that, just as far as I know right now, do not exist or exist in very limited ways.
That would be a wonderful addition in terms of commentary on the definition, because it's absolutely right on the money. And I mean, I don't want to, I did write a paper that said 10 places where collective impact gets it wrong. But
I read it.
the people who are doing collective impact have figured out ways to use the money, because it's the only money that's available.
Exactly.
And use it so that it, it includes the community. They're giving the power to the community in spite of what collective impact is written. So,
and then it brings up some really important ethics questions and perhaps practice questions of like, so for me in my position, I'm trying to decide which evaluation contracts we're going to pick up. So is there a world in which, we set some kind of internal policy that says we're only going to do the projects that have some kind of memorandum, or at least they have some kind of commitment to doing that kind of work? What a luxury, by the way. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be possible, but we could, but it's aspirational.
Well, we all do it in some small way. People come to us with a project and their terms are just offensive, and we don't take it.
Correct.
We may not have a written document that says what we'll do and we won't do.
Correct.
So it would be a wonderful commentary for the Global Journal, because I think that's a real critical place, which is how do we take our values and impose it on what's coming at us, as opposed to just try to, not just do what they say or angle around it.
And I also say, as someone who very much does not come from the field and sort of found myself in community development work, thankful for it. As I'm looking at the foundational principles, I mentioned to Annie, I think, I think some of the important work of racial equity work, racial justice, liberation work, is very much about what we name and call out. And so I think just in looking at the first 5 foundational principles, if we're thinking about ways to expand that, I think very explicitly talking about the elevation of marginalized or minoritized persons and voices. And I also think very much naming certain groups that need to be centered in the conversation, and at the same time naming certain groups that we ask to take a step back. I think that kind of very explicit and direct language is necessary. One just for the just the pure value of it. But secondly, because that naming of it will put certain participants back on their heels in a way that they realize they have to reach for an understanding, which provides time to educate and set some things in place that you otherwise wouldn't have if you sort of maintain a more vague and less explicit language.
Brilliant. I think it raises, do we not just update this brief one paragraph definition of practice, but can we go back and update the competencies, which are also a decade old or less, I mean, maybe less than that, but they also need some updating. And I think, you know, explicitly saying that the community is at the table. We tried to do that in the paper on Collaborating for Equity and Justice, to say that they are at the table and they are at least equal partners. But we, you know, you don't even, it's very hard to find examples of where people, A, have them at the table, and B, have them at the table in a way that they're calling the shots. Because none of us who are professionals like to give up our power and, you know, our privilege. So it's a really good point.
And I'd say, this will be my last thing, I promise. There is real value we're finding in the project we're working on now, unpacking what community means. Because to say community at the table also can become a sticking point, and it puts even certain power brokers within marginalized communities at the table and not other people.
Yep.
Folks, I wanted to just add to what Erin had to say. This is Rosa Guzman-Snyder from NCFL. Along with the community agreements, I think that one of the kind of pitfalls that we can run into in this idea of community engagement and having residents and community at the table is the issue of tokenizing, right? And how we prevent that. And I think we need to be very intentional about how funders, coalitions, groups are bringing in community at the table and what agreements they are making with communities. So some of our work just recently in Dallas, we're creating a network of promotoras, or what we call like these health workers or community education or health workers, that organizations would now have access to support their work. But it needs to be a two-way street, right? You can't just have this group of strong community leaders at the table all of the time without nonprofits coming back and saying, these are the agreements, this is what we are, this is how we're sharing our power, and this is also how we're compensating these community members who are putting in the time and the effort and their expertise into the projects that we're working with. So I think there needs to be some intentionality about how those community agreements work, but also how we prevent tokenism in this space.
You know, when I do workshops on community engagement, I always use the ladder of Arnstein's ladder of participation. And the bottom ones are, you know, tokenism, et cetera. And the top ones are all sharing power. And I say, before you bring people to the table, have a discussion and decide where you're going. And you may decide that you really only want tokenism, but at least be explicit about it. They say, well, you know, we're coming in here and we're going to share power, but they don't give you the information, they don't give you the budget, they don't, you know, let you see what's going on. But that's a very hard decision. And, you know, although I do it every time I teach this stuff, I don't know that the communities actually use it. We're running out of time, and this discussion shouldn't stop, in my thought. And we could use the same time and pick it up in 2 weeks, because I'd like to think about how do we get some of this brilliance that's been shared into that issue of the Global Journal. And if you're thinking about it too, now remember what Nicole said, the Global Journal takes all kinds of stuff. So if you want to have you and your community video discussion about how you share power, that would be a wonderful addition. It doesn't have to be a formal, and it certainly doesn't have to be a formal evaluated paper, because that would be hypocritical in what we were just talking about for the last hour. People have thoughts about how to keep this moving. Does anybody have the patience to do this for another hour to see if we can crystallize it? No, none of the patience for it. Okay. writing some of it. I don't want to lose this. I'm trying to figure out, anybody have thoughts about how to not to lose this, how to keep it going?
Are we gonna have time to talk about that during the biennial or not really?
I can't be at the biennial, but certainly it could happen. I don't know that it's scheduled.
So
Can we then have a video call also to include those that are not able to be at the biennial during that talk, if we're able to do that?
You should be able to have your meeting via Zoom at the biennial. I'm still trying to get clarification on that. So you should be able to be there.
That's Jean Hill from SCRA talking.
Thank you, Jean. I did want to go ahead and say that Dave and I and Tiffany Jimenez and Jessica Drum, am I missing someone, Dave? I can't remember.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think I can't remember either.
Yeah, we're having a roundtable about the continuum of practice and what that looks like. So this conversation can absolutely, I think, also happen there. I don't want to lose a whole month. So I'm happy to, to continue this conversation, as quickly or as often as we need to. But I did want to go ahead and say that if you are planning to attend the biennial, that there is a roundtable about practice in this definition that we can certainly integrate some of these thoughts into.
And we would welcome, we've had 23 people on at one point or another, we didn't hear from 23. So anybody who would like to drop an email to us, Nicole and David and I will be talking about how we move forward with the special issue, but also with this discussion. It's really been one of the most exciting discussions I've been part of for years around community psychology and practice. And so I think we are on the edge, and I think you're on the edge more than I'm on the edge of cutting changes that are going to change things, the cutting edge of changes about where the power is and how we deal with communities and how they have the table as opposed to us. Any last thoughts from anybody?
Is there someone, Jean or Nicole, who can capture who was on this call?
No, we don't have a way of doing that unless someone took a roll call.
We didn't. Maybe I can call off the names of people who called me to see if they were actually on here.
You can just do it in the message, do it in the chat.
There's another group coming on in 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, so the other thing is that we can also go back and look through the recording and just write down what we see and confirm sort of asynchronously that way.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
Yeah, and you can get a report from Zoom too.
Not for
Would it be easier for all of us just to email one person so you will know who it was, like in one mail chain?
I can go through the emails of all the people who said they were going to be on, and I can send something out. But if you didn't email me, then make sure you put something in the Zoom chat and we'll capture it there.
Okay. Thank you, Jean. I know that there's others.
Thank you all very much.
Appreciate everybody. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thanks.
Be well.